I let a powerful man's son turn himself into the public face of a scientific failure so complete that his own name is now used as a cautionary example in grant review panels. I didn't sabotage a single experiment. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of pretending he understood things he didn't. My name is Victor, and for 14 years I ran one of the quietest, most respected materials laboratories in the country. The lab wasn't famous because we didn't chase headlines. We worked inside a concrete and glass research complex tucked behind a state university's engineering wing, the kind of place that didn't even have its name on the building. Our work fed into aerospace alloys, radiation-resistant composites, and experimental coatings that never made the news because they weren't supposed to fail. Silence was the point. If people were talking about your lab, it usually meant something had gone wrong. Our facility was not an office. It was a controlled environment, stacked with negative pressure rooms, vibration-isolated floors, and climate chambers that could simulate everything from Arctic cold to orbital thermal cycling. Access badges were tiered. Protocols were written in binders thicker than phone books. Every experiment had lineage, every data set had a chain of custody, and every modification required sign-off from 3 different committees. I wasn't just a lead researcher. I was the final checkpoint between curiosity and catastrophe.
That system worked until Silas arrived. Silas was the university provost's only son, freshly installed as Director of Research Innovation. That title didn't exist before him. It was invented during a board meeting where the words visibility, thought leadership, and future-facing were used so often they lost all meaning. Silas was 32, tall, immaculately dressed, and spoke in confident paragraphs that sounded impressive until you realized they were made entirely of buzzwords and borrowed phrases. He had never run an experiment longer than a week. He had never waited 6 months for a crystal lattice to stabilize. But he had a personal brand, a growing social media following, and a burning need to be seen as a visionary. In a high-containment research lab, that combination is dangerous. Silas didn't break rules loudly. He eroded them quietly. He started attending lab meetings uninvited, sitting at the head of the table and asking why our timelines were so conservative. He questioned why we ran redundant validation cycles when the initial data already told a compelling story. He didn't argue chemistry or physics. He argued optics. He wanted clean graphs fast. He wanted results that photographed well. He wanted to be able to say, "my lab," in interviews. The first time I corrected him in public, I saw something harden behind his eyes. In our world, experiments aren't finished when they look right. They're finished when they survive repetition by people who don't want them to succeed. Silas hated that philosophy. He believed confidence could substitute for rigor. He began pushing junior researchers to reorder test sequences so early data looked more dramatic. He asked postdocs to tighten confidence intervals without changing sample sizes. He framed this as narrative clarity, not manipulation. But anyone who had survived peer review could see the danger. I pulled him aside after one particularly reckless suggestion involving an unvalidated thermal cycling shortcut. I explained, calmly, that external auditors would tear it apart, that aerospace partners would blacklist us if repeatability failed, that reputational damage in this field was permanent. He smiled, thanked me for my perspective, and then did exactly what he wanted anyway. From that moment on, he treated my lab like a stage, and me like an obstacle. Silas began scheduling press walkthroughs during active testing windows. He insisted on bringing donors into observation galleries while experiments were mid-run, ignoring vibration sensitivity warnings because the optics felt important. He demanded early access to raw datasets so he could tease results online before internal verification. When I refused, citing protocol, he accused me of gatekeeping innovation and being emotionally invested in outdated models of authority. In a research lab, that accusation is poison. He started building a narrative that I was slowing progress,
that I was resistant to change, that my caution wasn't professionalism but fear. He never said it directly in writing. He said it in conversations, in meetings with administrators, in carefully framed concerns about whether I was still aligned with the university's evolving mission. I noticed small changes after that. Committee emails stopped including me. Decisions about project direction were made before I arrived in the room. A new compliance officer named Julian appeared, fresh out of policy school, who treated Silas's opinions like gospel and my objections like inconveniences. Silas had learned the most important rule of institutional warfare: never attack expertise head-on, undermine the context it depends on. The lab itself began to feel different. Not physically, everything still hummed at the right frequency, the chambers still held pressure, but socially, younger researchers became hesitant to ask questions. They worried about optics. They worried about being labeled difficult. Silas rewarded people who gave him fast, confident answers, even when those answers were incomplete. He praised ambition and dismissed caution as insecurity. That is how real damage starts in scientific environments, not with explosions or alarms, but with subtle permission to stop being thorough. I tried to shield my team. I corrected reports quietly. I insisted on internal replication even when Silas rolled his eyes. I took responsibility for delays so junior staff wouldn't be punished for doing things correctly. For months, I acted as a buffer, absorbing pressure and smoothing over decisions that would have otherwise collapsed under scrutiny. And Silas let me, because as long as I was fixing his messes, he could keep pretending they didn't exist. What he didn't understand was that my authority didn't come from my title. It came from trust, from external partners who knew that if data came from our lab, it would hold up anywhere. From reviewers who recognized our formatting and knew exactly how much pain had gone into every clean figure. Silas thought that reputation belonged to the institution. He believed he could inherit it. He was wrong. The day I realized how wrong he was came during a closed-door meeting with the university's strategic council. Silas presented a preliminary dataset from one of our long-term materials endurance projects. He spoke confidently about breakthrough stability curves and future applications. When I asked where the third cycle degradation analysis was, he dismissed it as pending refinement and moved on. Everyone else nodded. That was the moment I understood the rules had changed. Precision no longer mattered unless it served a story. Silence was being mistaken for consent. And if I continued to quietly correct him, he would eventually succeed in rewriting the lab's identity with his name on it. So I made a decision that went against every instinct I had developed over a career spent preventing failure. I stopped saving him. I followed every protocol, I documented every instruction, I let Silas put his name on things he didn't fully understand, and I waited, knowing that in our world, reality doesn't argue, it verifies. The first real escalation came disguised as a favor. Silas announced that he had secured a strategic collaboration with a private aerospace startup that wanted early access to our materials endurance data. He framed it as an honor, a vote of confidence in our lab. What he didn't mention, until the contract was already signed, was that the startup's timelines were driven by investor demos, not engineering reality. They wanted numbers they could show, fast. In our lab, endurance testing wasn't a slideshow. Some of our composites went through thousands of thermal cycles, each one logged, monitored, and analyzed for microfractures that didn't appear until long after the initial curves looked perfect. Silas instructed Julian to prioritize responsiveness and asked me to authorize data release after the first successful cycle batch. I refused. I explained again that partial endurance data without full degradation profiles was worse than useless, that once numbers left our controlled environment, we lost the ability to contextualize them, that external engineers would treat early curves as representative, not preliminary. Silas smiled and said he appreciated my commitment to rigor, then asked Julian to note that I was uncomfortable with accelerated collaboration. 2 days later, I learned the data had been released anyway. Not the raw files, but cleaned graphs, smoothed curves, annotated projections extrapolated well beyond the tested range. My lab's formatting, Silas's name at the top as supervising director. When I confronted him, he said the startup understood the data was preliminary and accused me of being territorial. He reminded me that the university's mission included partnership and impact. I went to the compliance committee. I brought documentation. I explained exactly how the projections were misleading. They listened politely, then asked whether there had been a formal protocol violation. On paper, there hadn't been. The data was real, the labels said preliminary, the disclaimers existed, buried in footnotes. Silas had learned how to stay just inside the lines. The second incident was personal. Our lab operated under a strict access hierarchy. Certain chambers required not just clearance, but presence logs and supervisor oversight because contamination or mishandling could invalidate months of work. Silas began bypassing that structure. He brought visitors, donors, administrators, potential partners into observation corridors during live experiments without notifying the floor leads. He treated the lab like a museum exhibit, gesturing toward active rigs while narrating breakthroughs that hadn't yet survived replication. One afternoon, I arrived to find a vibration-sensitive deposition run flagged for irregularities. The logs showed multiple corridor door openings during the process. When I reviewed the security footage, I saw Silas leading a small group through the gallery, laughing, tapping the glass, ignoring posted warnings. That run represented 6 weeks of preparatory work. It was now compromised. I didn't explode. I didn't accuse. I requested a meeting. I explained how vibration propagated through the structure. I showed him the sensor data. I told him, calmly, that even small disturbances could introduce defects invisible to the naked eye, but devastating under stress. He leaned back in his chair and said that if our systems were that fragile, maybe they weren't ready for real-world application. He suggested we needed to stress test our assumptions. The next day, an email went out announcing revised visitor engagement guidelines authored by Silas and approved by administration. They allowed observation access during active testing at the discretion of the Director of Research Innovation. My discretion had been removed.
The third escalation cut deeper because it struck at the core of how scientific careers live or die: authorship. In our field, publication isn't about ego, it's about accountability. Your name on a paper means you stand behind every figure, every assumption, every conclusion. Silas began inserting himself as lead or corresponding author on manuscripts he hadn't contributed to beyond attending summary meetings. He justified it by saying leadership deserved visibility. Julian supported him, citing internal policy language about strategic oversight roles. I objected, quietly at first, then formally. I wrote memos outlining contribution requirements. I cited external journal standards. I explained that misattributed authorship wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. If questions arose, the listed authors would be accountable. Silas brushed it off. He said I was clinging to outdated academic hierarchies. He accused me of resenting his assent. The breaking point came when he submitted a paper to a major materials journal without my review. The manuscript referenced long-term stability conclusions that were not supported by the full data set. He had cherry-picked a subset of runs that aligned with his narrative. When I discovered it, the submission was already under review. I requested it be withdrawn. Silas refused. He said pulling it would signal weakness and undermine confidence. I went to the department chair. I laid everything out: the unauthorized data use, the authorship concerns, the visitor access violations. The chair sighed, told me this was a growing pains issue, and suggested I work on improving my relationship with Silas. That was when I understood that institutional inertia was on Silas's side. From then on, the pressure increased.
Silas began scheduling meetings over my existing commitments, then noting my absence in follow-up emails. He questioned my responsiveness when I refused to approve rushed decisions. He asked Julian to audit my project timelines for patterns of delay. Junior researchers started receiving mixed signals, torn between following protocol and pleasing the man whose name carried administrative weight. I tried mediation. I proposed clearer boundaries. I asked for written clarification of roles and decision authority. Silas agreed enthusiastically, then ensured the final document was vague enough to grant him discretionary power everywhere it mattered. Every attempt I made to resolve things professionally was reframed as resistance. What Silas didn't realize was that I was no longer trying to win arguments. I was observing behavior. I was documenting decisions. I was mapping how influence flowed and where accountability stopped. I noticed how often Silas overrode caution with confidence, how frequently he substituted narrative for verification, how eager he was to attach his name to work before it had faced real scrutiny. In science, that combination doesn't cause immediate failure. It causes delayed collapse.
And the more Silas escalated, the more he positioned himself as the sole architect of the lab's new direction. He wanted ownership. He wanted credit. He wanted to be the face of progress. I stopped shielding him from that. I continued to do my job impeccably. I followed every instruction as written. I let Silas sign off on his own decisions, and I waited for the moment when his confidence would be tested by people who didn't care about his title, his lineage, or his story. Because eventually, every experiment leaves the lab, and the world doesn't grade on charisma. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or public humiliation. It came quietly, wrapped in professional language and delivered with a smile. I found out on a Tuesday morning, the same way I'd learned to expect bad news over the past year, through an automated email. The subject line was neutral enough to be meaningless. Committee Review Outcome, Advanced Materials Fellowship. I'd applied for that fellowship 6 months earlier. It wasn't a vanity grant. It was a career-defining opportunity, the kind that gave you independent authority, protected funding, and, most importantly, autonomy. It would have allowed me to spin off a dedicated research unit, free from administrative interference. I had been encouraged to apply by external partners who trusted my work and wanted me insulated from internal politics. I opened the email expecting revisions or delays. Instead, it informed me that my application had been withdrawn. Not rejected, withdrawn. I stared at the screen for a long time before I understood what that meant. Withdrawals required confirmation from the applicant or their designated institutional representative. I hadn't withdrawn anything. I walked down the corridor to the administrative office, badge humming as the locks disengaged. The secretary avoided my eyes when I asked who had authorized the withdrawal. She slid a printed form across the desk. It bore my name, my project title, and Silas's signature under the line marked Institutional Endorsement. The justification field was filled in neatly. Applicant demonstrates difficulty aligning with strategic innovation goals and exhibits resistance to collaborative leadership frameworks. In one sentence, Silas had poisoned 15 years of credibility. I requested a meeting immediately. He didn't respond. I emailed the fellowship committee directly, attaching documentation and asking for clarification. Their reply was polite, distant, and final. Withdrawn applications could not be reinstated. They trusted the institution's internal assessment. That fellowship wasn't just money. It was my exit ramp. It was my future. Silas had taken it from me with a pen stroke. When I finally cornered him outside a planning meeting, he looked almost amused. He told me I should have discussed my long-term plans with him before applying.
He said leadership positions required trust, and trust required alignment. He said I was brilliant but inflexible, and that the committee needed to see a unified vision. I asked him how submitting false assessments aligned with academic integrity. He shrugged and said integrity was contextual. That was the moment something in me went completely still. Not angry, not hurt. Cold. I stopped arguing. I stopped appealing. I stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. I nodded, thanked him for his candor, and went back to my lab. For the first time since Silas arrived, I didn't try to fix the situation. I sat at my desk long after the building emptied, staring at the hum of the environmental monitors. I thought about every time I had quietly corrected a report, rerun a compromised test, or delayed a submission to protect the lab's reputation. I thought about how often I had absorbed blame so younger researchers wouldn't suffer. I thought about how Silas had used my professionalism as cover while dismantling the systems that made it possible. Playing by the rules hadn't failed because the rules were wrong. They'd failed because Silas wasn't bound by them.
That night, I opened a new folder on my secure drive. I labeled it simply Documentation. Inside it, I began copying everything. Every email where Silas overrode protocol, every meeting note where decisions were made without technical justification, every authorship change, every instance where visitor access had compromised runs, every dataset released prematurely under his directive. I didn't editorialize. I didn't comment. I preserved context, timestamps, and original formatting. I wasn't building a case. I was building a record. Over the next few weeks, Silas escalated further, emboldened by his success in kneecapping my fellowship. He began openly excluding me from project reviews, then asking why my teams weren't moving faster. He reassigned oversight of one of my long-term stability programs to Julian, despite Julian lacking the necessary clearance. When I objected, Silas cited my diminished scope following the fellowship withdrawal. He had decided my career was already over. What he didn't realize was that by cutting me out, he had also removed the last safeguard between his ambition and reality. A major inflection point arrived in the form of an external validation audit. Our lab was scheduled for a comprehensive review by an international consortium that provided certification for materials used in aerospace and defense applications. This wasn't optional. Without their approval, our work would be academically interesting and commercially useless. The audit involved replication requests, blind testing, and direct interviews with supervising researchers. Silas saw it as a branding opportunity. He announced that he would personally lead the audit response. He instructed teams to route all auditor communication through his office. He framed it as streamlining messaging and ensuring consistency. Administrators applauded the initiative. I requested, in writing, clarification on my role as the senior technical authority for several of the audited projects. Silas replied, copying half the department, that my input would be consulted as needed. I understood exactly what that meant. For the first time in my career, I followed instructions to the letter and nothing more. When auditors requested clarification on testing intervals, I forwarded the request to Silas. When they asked about discrepancies between published curves and raw data, I noted that Silas had approved the publication and deferred. When they asked why certain degradation profiles were missing third-cycle analysis, I provided the documentation showing the tests were still ongoing at the time of release. No opinions, no warnings, just facts. Silas, meanwhile, grew more visible. He hosted briefings, he posted photos from the audit on professional networks, he talked about transparency and innovation. He spoke confidently about methodologies he couldn't reproduce and conclusions he couldn't defend. I watched from the edges, calm and detached, as he walked further into exposure.
The final personal blow came when I learned that Silas had quietly recommended my reassignment. Not termination, something more surgical. He proposed transferring me to a satellite administrative role, overseeing compliance documentation for undergraduate labs, a position with no research authority, no graduate students, and no path back. A professional dead end disguised as a lateral move. The justification cited organizational harmony. That was when I knew there was no return. This wasn't about difference in vision anymore, it was about erasure. Silas didn't just want to lead, he wanted to remove any reminder that the lab had existed before him. I didn't contest the proposal. I didn't file a grievance. I didn't rally allies. Instead, I finalized my documentation folder. I verified every file. I cross-referenced approvals. I made sure that every decision Silas had made was traceable to him alone, without my intervention or modification. I also noticed something else. Silas had positioned himself as the sole authority for the audit, which meant that when the audit concluded, the results would belong to him. I began sleeping better after that realization, because I understood something Silas never had. In science, the moment you insist on owning the outcome is the moment you become responsible for it, and the audit was nearly complete. I stopped feeling anything about my stolen fellowship, about my sidelined career, about the years I'd poured into protecting a system that no longer wanted me. All of that burned away, leaving something clean and focused behind. I wasn't going to fight Silas. I was going to let him finish what he'd started, without me standing between him and the consequences. And for the first time since his arrival, I was looking forward to the results. I didn't sabotage anything. That's important. In a material science lab, especially one tied to aerospace contracts, you don't need to sabotage, you just need to stop correcting lies. The external audit had been scheduled for months. Officially, it was routine, a joint review by a federal standards body and 2 aerospace partners who were considering scaling our alloy from prototype to flight-qualified material. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a stress test of leadership. Silas had rushed 3 papers out the door in the past year, each one claiming breakthroughs that shaved weight while increasing fatigue resistance. On paper, it was miraculous. In reality, it was impossible. I had flagged the inconsistencies early: grain boundary diagrams that didn't match the SEM images, fatigue curves that were mathematically too smooth, heat treatment logs copied verbatim across different batches. Silas brushed all of it off as formatting issues or data normalization. Before, I'd quietly rerun tests, fix plots, and keep the machine humming. This time, I didn't. The auditors arrived on a Tuesday morning, 5 of them, calm, polite, devastatingly precise. They didn't start with accusations, they started with requests, raw data. Not processed graphs, not summarized tables, raw output from the fatigue rigs, thermal cycling chambers, and fracture toughness tests, time-stamped files, machine logs, calibration certificates. Silas smiled too much and told them it would take a few hours to compile. He looked at me, expecting me to nod, to step in, to magically produce clean folders like I always had. I smiled back and said, everything published should already be archived under the director's credentials. That was the first crack. By noon, the auditors were frowning. File names didn't match dates in the papers. Some raw datasets simply didn't exist. Others existed but showed early failures that never appeared in the published endurance curves. One auditor asked Silas to explain why an alloy reported to survive 10 million load cycles had, according to the machine log, fractured at just under 3 million. Silas tried to improvise. He talked about sample variants, about outliers, about reruns that must not have synced. The auditors nodded and asked for the rerun data. There was none. Then came the live demonstration. This was Silas's idea. He loved theatrics.
He insisted that a real-time stress test of the latest alloy prototype would put concerns to rest. I advised against it, carefully, in writing. I noted that the sample batch had not completed full thermal aging and that extrapolating endurance from partial data was scientifically unsound. Silas overruled me, also in writing. The test was set up in the main testing bay, a scaled structural component fabricated from the alloy Silas had built his reputation on. Hydraulic actuators, load sensors, a growing audience of auditors, engineers, and one very quiet representative from an aerospace firm whose logo was worth more than our entire annual budget. The test began smoothly. Initial load cycles held. Silas narrated confidently, explaining how the microstructure resisted crack propagation, how the alloy wanted to flex rather than fail. At 2.9 million cycles, I felt it before I heard it. A subtle change in vibration, a sound like a breath catching. At 2.9 million cycles, the component failed catastrophically. Not a graceful fracture, a brittle snap along a grain boundary that should not have existed if the alloy had been processed as published. Sensors spiked, alarms chirped. The room went silent, except for the hydraulic system winding down. One of the auditors walked over and asked, very calmly, "Is this the same composition and process described in your paper from last quarter?" Silas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The auditors didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They requested the processing logs for that specific sample, the heat treatment schedule, the compositional analysis, the chain of custody from melt to machining. The logs showed gaps, entire steps missing, temperatures rounded to suspiciously clean numbers, and when cross-referenced with the raw data already flagged, a pattern emerged that no amount of confidence could smooth over. The fake science collapsed under its own weight. By the end of the day, the auditors had stopped asking questions and started writing findings. Silas sat alone at the conference table, staring at the failed component like it had betrayed him, when in reality, it had simply told the truth. I went back to my office and closed the door. My hands were steady, my notes were immaculate. The trap hadn't been a trick, it had been reality. Unedited. Exposure in academia doesn't explode, it corrodes. The audit report landed 3 weeks later, and it was brutal in the most understated way possible. Phrases like systemic data misrepresentation, failure to maintain primary records, and negligent oversight of safety-critical research appeared repeatedly. Silas's name appeared on every page. The aerospace partners didn't issue angry press releases. They simply withdrew. Funding paused indefinitely. Contracts terminated under clauses Silas had signed without reading. The lab's flagship program, the one he'd used as his personal pedestal, was frozen pending a full review. Universities talk. Funding agencies talk more. Within a month, Silas's published papers were under investigation by their journals. Retraction notices followed, one by one. Each one cited inability to produce raw data on request. That phrase is poison. It doesn't accuse, it condemns. Students distanced themselves quietly, postdocs updated their CVs, collaborators stopped returning emails. Silas went from being introduced as a visionary director to being referred to, awkwardly, in the past tense. Then came the formal finding: academic fraud. Not a criminal charge, something worse for a man like Silas, a professional death sentence. He lost his eligibility to serve as a principal investigator on federally funded research. His name was flagged in grant systems. Review boards rejected anything associated with him automatically. He tried to defend himself publicly, claimed misunderstandings, blamed administrative chaos, suggested that subordinates had failed him. No one believed him. The failed demo video circulated internally among aerospace firms. Engineers are merciless about physics. You can argue philosophy, you can spin management, You cannot argue with a crack propagating exactly where theory says it shouldn't.
Silas resigned before he could be formally removed. His resignation letter spoke about new directions and unfair scrutiny. It convinced no one. He applied to private industry. They asked for references. He listed me. I never got the call. As for the lab, the institution moved quickly once the bleeding stopped. An interim review board assessed leadership options. The auditor's report included an appendix noting that despite directorial failures, the underlying technical staff and internal documentation were exceptionally thorough. My name appeared there too. I was asked, formally this time, to step into the director role. I accepted with conditions: full transparency, independent data audits, no publishing without raw data escrowed and verified, systems over personalities. The lab changed after that. Slowly, then all at once. Trust returned. Funding followed. New partners came in, cautious but curious. We restarted the alloy program from scratch, this time letting the material tell us what it could actually do. It wasn't as miraculous as Silas's papers had claimed. It was better, reliable, honest, fit for flight. I heard, months later, that Silas tried teaching at a small private institute overseas. The offer was rescinded after someone Googled his name. Academic blacklists aren't official. They don't need to be. I don't feel triumph when I think of him. I feel relief. Because science isn't about brilliance or confidence or titles. It's about respect for reality. You can ignore it for a while. You can dress it up with graphs and jargon and signatures. But eventually, under enough load, the truth fails you, or you fail it. All I did was stop standing between Silas and that moment. And when the structure broke, it did so exactly where the lies were,